Which teams in the Big 12 were overrated? Which teams were underrated? Which teams were better or worse than their record? We're going to look at how teams performed in one possession games here in this video. And again, this does sometimes give us an indication of which teams were better or worse than we thought. And it can kind of help us next year with predictions. Wanted to wrap this up. So yeah, we did the SEC and the Big 10 a couple of weeks ago. Then kind of got off track a little bit with my way too early top 25 playoff predictions, all of that. But yeah, I wanted to wrap this up with the Big 12 and the ACC. Also, big announcement coming up on Saturday. Make sure you watch for that, February 1st. Big news here on the channel. So let's first just kind of looking back at 2023 and, what could we take away from that year that could have possibly given us an indication of teams that were better or worse going into this past season. And I'll tell you what, Oklahoma State was 4-1 in one possession games in 2023. That kind of would give an indication that Oklahoma State wasn't as good as we thought, and this team might go down a little bit. Well, they went down a lot, so there is something to it sometimes, not always. TCU was 0-4 in one-score games, so you thought maybe they'd bounce back and have a better year this year, and they did. So like I said, it's not always going to tell us which teams are overrated or underrated, or which teams are trending in the right or wrong direction for the next season, but a lot of times it does. So let's just get into it here, and we'll start at the top of the standings. The top records here, just again looking at the regular season: Arizona State, Iowa State, BYU all were 10-2. Colorado was 9-3. Baylor and TCU were 8-4. We had some other 8-4 teams as well. We'll get to them on the next graphic. So how were these teams in one possession games? Let's start with Arizona State. They were 5-1, so they were really good in the one-score games. Iowa State was really good in the one-score games, 4-1. BYU was 4-2, so all three of these teams, that's kind of why they finished at the top, because they were able to win close games. If those games go a different direction, then these teams are in the middle of the pack in the Big 12. So that is, when there is so much parity like the Big 12, like when you have this conference is so even, and it always is, it comes down to how you perform in one-score games. That's pretty much always how this conference goes. That's why it's so tough to predict, because you don't know who's going to win those close games. And this year it was Arizona State, Iowa State, and BYU. Colorado was 2-1. Baylor was only 1-2 and still finished 8-4. That tells me maybe watch out for Baylor next year. This could be a dangerous team. I did have them in my way too early top 25. TCU from 0-4 to 4-2, so they turn things around, and that's usually the way it goes. If you're not good, if you lose a lot of close games one year, the next year, the odds just kind of say you're probably going to win those games. It doesn't always work out that way. Of course, we've got teams like Nebraska that just never win one-score games, and then we have some teams that are just really good every year. But yeah, I would watch out for Baylor, at least based off of this graphic. I'm not saying they're going to win the Big 12, but definitely a team to watch out for. And then I'd look at Arizona State, Iowa State, and BYU. Which one or maybe two of those teams is going to drop off next year, because it's probably going to happen, and we'll see who can predict that correctly. Right now, I'm kind of high on those teams, though, so I don't know if I'll pick one of those teams to really drop off too much. So how about the best case scenario? If these teams had won all of their one-score games, well, Arizona State would have been 11-1. Iowa State would have been 11-1. And look at BYU. They could have been 12-0. They were only a few plays away from being undefeated. And, of course, going to the college football playoff, going to the Big 12 championship first, and then probably going to the college football playoff. Colorado, and if that had happened and BYU had lost, let's say in the Big 12 championship, the Big 12 would have got two teams in the playoffs. So that would have been interesting. Colorado would have been 10-2. Baylor could have been 10-2. TCU could have been 10-2. So you see the best case scenario, what could have been for these teams. And then we look at the teams that, we look at the scenario where if they lost all their one-score games, look at the different seasons these teams could have had. Arizona State could have been 5-7, much closer to where they were expected to be. Iowa State could have been 6-6. BYU 6-6. Colorado and Baylor still would have been 7-5, still would have pretty good seasons. And then TCU could have been just 4-8. So it's just so important when you're in a conference, especially like the Big 12, to find a way to win these close games, because you're usually going to have 4, 5, 6 of these types of games. All right, so let's see what the actual record would have been if these teams had split all their one-score games. BYU would have been at the top. BYU would have been 9-3, would have had the best record. Arizona State would have been 8-4. Iowa State would have been just ahead of them. Actually, Iowa State, Colorado, and Baylor all would have been ahead of Arizona State. That's interesting. And then TCU would have been just 7-5. So big takeaways here. Again, Arizona State, Iowa State, BYU. Odds are that these teams will not be as successful in one-score games next year. And I would say one or two of them will drop off. And I'm not saying they're going to go 4-8, but I would say one or two of them will drop off and not be at the top of this conference. Maybe more like 7-5, something like that. Again, it's very early. I haven't started predictions or anything, but that's just kind of the trend here. And I may not go with that. I may pick them all at the top again. I don't know. I'm just saying that's something that usually is a decent indicator. So let's go now to the next teams. Texas Tech and Kansas State were 8-4. Kansas State, by the way, was also a team that was bad in one-score games last year. We'll see if that looks any better this year. West Virginia was good in one-score games last year. We'll see what they did this year in just a second. Kansas, Cincinnati, Utah, all 5-7. So let's take a look. How are these teams in one-score games? Well, Texas Tech was 6-1. Maybe this team was overrated a little bit. Kansas State 3-2. So they were not good in one-score games last year. This past season, they were better, 3-2. West Virginia, good in one-score games 2 years in a row. That could be bad news for this next season, potentially. Kansas, of course, 1-5. And it's like a line. You just drop the line. You draw a line under West Virginia. So all these teams above West Virginia were good in one-score games. The teams that finished below 500 were bad in one-score games. Look at Kansas at 1-5, Cincinnati at 1-5, Utah at 1-5. These teams were not as bad as their records would suggest because they just lost a lot of close games. So if they'd won all their close games, these teams, look at the records. This is what could have been this past season. Texas Tech could have been 9-3, Kansas State 10-2, West Virginia not much better, 7-5, but Kansas could have been 10-2. That's why, I talked about this team being one of the best 5-7 teams in all of college football. We talked about like Kansas and Auburn, and maybe there was a couple more teams that were 5-7 but lost a lot of close games. Cincinnati could have been 9-3, and Utah could have been 10-2, which is what most people expected them to be. You wonder if Cam Rising had stayed healthy, would that have been enough to win some close games? And who knows, maybe Utah would have been right there at the top like they were expected to be, but no, they did not win those close games. And if these teams lost all their one-score games, look at Texas Tech. Could have been 2-10. All but two of their wins were by one score. I know Texas Tech did really well in the transfer portal. It's a team that a lot of people are expecting to be a lot better next year. This number tells me let's be careful. Let's be careful before we predict Texas Tech to go, 10-2 next year. I'm not saying they won't. I'm not saying that I won't predict that, but it's just something you have to keep in mind where you have to look at this team, and this team maybe was not quite as good as their record would indicate. Kansas State 5-7, West Virginia 3-9, Kansas 4-8, Cincinnati 4-8, and Utah 4-8. And if these teams split their one-score games, what would their records have actually been? Well, Kansas State would have the best record at 7.5 wins. And then you would have Kansas and Utah at 7-5, then Cincinnati, and then Texas Tech. So that's what I'm talking about. If Texas Tech had just split their one-score games, they would have been, 5-7 or 6-6. And you look at Kansas and Utah, teams that would have had much better seasons. So that's interesting there. I would say the big takeaway here, again, Texas Tech, maybe not as good as we're expecting them to be next year, or maybe they are because of the additions in the transfer portal. Maybe they don't have a lot of close games next year. Maybe they're really good. We'll see. But yeah, I'd say Kansas, Cincinnati, Utah, not as bad as you thought they were. They just lost a lot of close games. And then we'll go to our final four teams here. Houston, UCF, Arizona, and Oklahoma State. In one-score games, Houston, I don't know if I just said Utah. Houston, 2-1 in one-score games. UCF, 1-3. Arizona, 0-2. Oklahoma State, 1-2. So these teams really didn't even have that many one-score games. These are just bad teams. That's really what it comes down to. You see, what could have been. UCF could have been 7-5. Could have had a better season. Arizona could have made a bowl game, but these teams are still going to have bad years. It could have been even worse. 2-10, 3-9, 4-8, 2-10. So if they had split their one-score games, again, there's really not much to take away from these teams. These teams are all bad. We're just going to have to see if they can bounce back next year, but it's not necessarily because they just lost a lot of close games. These teams truly were bad football teams, and that shows here with these numbers. So would love to get your takeaways from the Big 12. Which teams did you think were overrated or underrated? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below.